Okay, Jakob, you can start.
Thank you, Jora.
Hmm.
Varieties. Hello, everybody. This is the Musaler dialect. Varieties means is hello. In the name of ARPA Institute, I will welcome you all and thank you all for participating in our presentations. The ARPA Institute has essentially monthly or sometimes twice a month lectures or panel discussions online using Zoom, and we send out our invitations through emails. If you get our email, then it means you already don't need, we have your email address. If you are not receiving it, please put your email address in the chat so that we can send you the upcoming emails, the announcements. And also we have a website where you can go and count our activities. It's www.arpainstitute.org. ARPA has been working in Armenia since 1992, and all the members of ARPA are experts in various fields, and our main objective is to provide technical and expert advice and guidance for Armenia. The name stands for Analysis, Research, and Planning for Armenia, and that's all we do. We try to analyze and find out what we can do to help in Armenia. And we work with the universities, various institutes of the Academy of Sciences, as well as the government, and try to do as much as we can and provide help. We have currently a few projects that are ongoing. One is we are now building a clean room, a 1000 class, which means 1000 particles per minute clean atmosphere, a clean room where they can do tests for sensitive, very sensitive devices that can be affected by even small molecules of powder or anything small in the air. So the room has to be very clean. This is the first class 1000 clean room in Armenia. We're building it in the Alekhanian National Lab, which used to be the Physics Institute, one of the most famous institutes of the Academy of Sciences. We're also working with another team in the Alekhanian National Lab, and that team works on what they call on a radio frequency photomultiplier tube, which essentially is a device that can measure laser pulses down to a femtosecond, which is very, very, very short time. And it can have applications in numerous areas, like it can make the strongest microscope that now exists 10 times stronger. So we are trying to help them so that it becomes actually applied on various devices and create some jobs in Armenia. We're also working to develop small businesses in the in the villages at the border with Azerbaijan or Turkey, so people can develop businesses and earn enough money to stay where they are. And we guide them, we provide them assistance, both financial and expert assistance, so they become profitable. We're also this year actually, for the first time, a formally accepted project by the government of Armenia, which is called science fairs. Some of you know that in the United States, all schools have science fairs where the students they actually come up with projects and try to make it an innovative project. They do experimentation, they present their results on a board, a display board, and then they present their results to judges. And the judges essentially quiz them and try to find if they really understand what they did. The main objective of this science fair is to teach the students how to think in a scientific way. In other words, become innovators and even solve problems using the scientific method. This is to help students from the beginning, from childhood, to learn the importance of science and technology, in addition to all the rest of the social sciences. We also have our annual invention competition for young scientists, and we get inventions in various fields. And then we send these inventions to experts. They evaluate all these inventions, and we select the winners. We give them monetary awards. This year, the award will be $5,000 for the first and $1,000 for the second, in order to encourage them to create new things and actually maybe even make it into a product and establish a business and create jobs. In addition to all these, we also provide instrumentation and also technical advice to various institutes of the Academy of Sciences, as well as the universities. For example, we have given to the Physical Research Institute in Ashtarak a spectrophotometer and a hypothermia device, which is very important for their research. Also, we have given instrumentation to the Chemical Physics Institute, to the Molecular Biology Institute. We've given quite a few instrumentation, especially a DNA analyzer, which is called a sequencer. And that was the first sequencer that we actually provided them in Armenia. And they have been doing quite a lot of research with the sequencer and publishing quite a lot of articles. So we're happy with the results. We have also given instrumentation to the universities, both the Yerevan State University and the Polytechnic University, as well as we have worked with other institutes. And as we said, we also work with the various ministries of the government, like the Ministry of Science, Education, Culture, and Sports. We also work with the Ministry of Health and various other ministries, providing them, again, guidance, advice, and even seminars. And we also have a program where we have online experts providing lectures on various topics, and they essentially transfer the most modern technologies to the students and the professors. And this is an interactive process. So these are the kinds of things ARPA has been doing in the past years. And the only way we do that in Armenia is through our community donations. So if you find our work worthy, please donate. And you can go to our website, and there will be a button there. You can click the button and donate. So thank you very much, you all, for participating. And now I hand it over to Lori so she can introduce Bert.
Yes, hello. Thank you everyone for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bert Fox. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll get started with his presentation. So,
Lorijan, please start your video.
You've disabled it, Jarajan. If you can give me permission, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Still disabled. Sorry, I am not unable to start it until you give me permission. Okay, well, I'll just talk. Dr. Fox is a professor of linguistics at Cambridge University and a fellow of King's College in the UK. He studied both Western Armenian and Classical Armenian Khdrbek. And he completed his PhD at Harvard University in 1994 with the title of Armenian Phonology. He also taught at Harvard for 9 years before taking up his current position at Cambridge in England. And his primary interests have been to document and study the hundreds of dialects of modern Armenian, from Ankara and Artvin to Zeytun and Zok. And his newest projects are to study the Armenian dialect of New Julfa, Isfahan, and the vowel harmony system of the Goris dialect. And these will be published through Oxford University Press. And he's also written a monograph on the Salmas dialect. And today, Dr. Vox is going to talk to us about the Musaler dialect from ancient times to modern. So it's my great pleasure to have him here. Thank you, Dr. Vox.
Thank you very much. Can you all see my slides now?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, let's
Great.
begin. Thank you for inviting me. It's always enjoyable to have a chance to work on the Armenian varieties spoken around Musaler. Today, I thought I would organize my presentation in terms of the transition from Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of the Musaler dialect in around 4000 BC, up to 2021. We are fortunate with the Musaler varieties to still have a number of speakers, whereas unfortunately, most of the 500 plus varieties of Armenian are not in even that good of shape. Let's start off with a little teaser. I have a little video here of Hagop Panosian, who has kindly helped me out extensively today with linguistic material. I'm going to play you a video of him saying something very short, and then we're going to have a poll where you can try to guess what he is saying in Musaler dialect. Here we go. Okay, I'll play it one more time and then we'll bring up the poll. Okay, Jora, can you put up the poll now?
Yes.
Let me see if I can play it again while the poll is showing. All right, everyone, have a guess at what Hagop is saying, the English translation of this Musaler utterance. And when you're done, hit submit, and then we'll see a report on what everyone has guessed. I'll give you all about a minute or two to enter in your answers. Here it is again. All right, one more time and then we'll see what results we have. Jora, can we see what the results are so far?
Yes.
Okay, where are you coming from is the majority form people have picked, followed by where did she find it, followed by the world is round. And then buttery lentils and issues aren't there. Didn't get many selections. The answer is, in fact, where did she find it? So here on the slide, I've given you a transcription of the Musaler utterance, so Yamur and then Yaqaldze, where it means from where did he, she, or it find it. And I've picked this example to illustrate not only how different the Musaler dialect is from other varieties of Armenian you may be familiar with, but also to show some of the points of linguistic interest that show up even in a small sample of the dialect. So here we can see, for example, that the I of Iqaldze is the outcome of the classical Armenian E prefix that was used in the third person singular aorist form. So the ancestor of this form in classical Armenian was egit, meaning he, she, or it found, where git is the root to find in classical Armenian. And that in turn comes from the Indo-European root wid, meaning to see or to know. And then it has the prefix E before it that was used in the Indo-Iranian branch and the Greek branch and the Armenian branch of Indo-European to mark aorist or other past tense forms, depending on the language branch. We can also see that the original Indo-European W, when before a vowel, became G in Armenian. And what's of particular interest here is that this G has actually become a voiceless uvular stop in this particular form in Musaler, so where you might have expected it to come out as a K in this particular form. We'll talk more about that later today. You can also see that this verb shifted conjugation class from the I class of egit into the A class, and then that underwent the regular shift in Musaler and the other Cilician and Syrian dialects to O. But then under certain conditions we'll talk about later today, that O can be lengthened to ow. So you end up getting this diphthong ow in the second syllable of the verb, which is very rare in Armenian dialects today. So early classical Armenian had ow, but it shifted to o in almost every variety of Armenian. But then some of the dialects in Cilicia, in Syria specifically, redeveloped an ow. And then you can also see that from egit, we had the regular development of that in the Cilician and Syrian dialects to a D. But then when you combine that with the Z of the following enclitic pronoun, Z, meaning it, it combines D plus Z to give what's written as a Z plus a Z, but it's pronounced by Hagop as a sort of Z. So an unreleased T plus a Z together. All of these features are highly unusual in the Armenian dialect world. The preservation of the old classical Armenian accusative prefix Z is also relatively unusual, though you do also find that in the dialects around the Mush area in Eastern Turkey historically. But it has mutated into something you can also use as a clitic pronoun that you attach at the right edge of a verb. So the Z at the end of Iqaldze is this old Z accusative marker that now means it as a clitic object. You find something similar in dialects of Armenian in Iran, but using instead the S, D, N forms rather than Z. So that's a little teaser for you of Musaler. And now let's launch into the heart of the talk. My plan for today is we're first going to cover some historical and general context about Musaler dialect. Then we'll go through some details of how the Indo-European proto-language developed into the present-day Musaler dialects. And then we'll look at some archaisms or preservations of old features in the Armenian family in the morphological domain, so the domain of word formation. And then we'll look at some innovations in Musaler in the phonological domain, or roughly speaking, the pronunciation domain. And then at the end, for fun, I'm going to have a little tidbit of paremiology, or the study of sayings and so on. Okay, let's start with some historical and general context. What and where is Musaler? Probably most of you in the audience will already know the answer to this, but I've prepared for the possibility that some of you are not Armenian or may not speak Armenian or may not be familiar with this particular variety of Armenian. So those of you who are actually from Musaler, I hope you'll bear with me during these bits. Musaler literally means Moses, Musa, Ler, the Armenian word for mountain. So it refers to the mountain of Moses, which is here up on the map about 18 kilometers west of classical Antioch, modern day Antakya, very close to the Mediterranean coast. And the Armenian name for this area is Musaler. And then there's a region down below the mountain, which in Armenia is sometimes called Sevedia, which is an Arabic borrowing. In Turkish, this area and the mountain were originally called Musa Dağı or Musa Dağı, but now it tends to be called Saman Dağı or Saman Dağı. And then in Arabic, the name is Jebel Musa. So you may have heard some or all of these to refer to the same entity, which is this mountain of Moses and the villages surrounding it historically. Where is and where was the Musaler dialect spoken? I'm going to focus today on the original villages around the mountain of Moses, but we'll talk very quickly also about the diaspora after 1915. So in the upper right corner, I've given you a close-up of the main villages where the Musaler dialect was spoken originally, and I've color-coded them to the three main subdialects of Musaler. So people traditionally say in the Armenian dialect world that there are three subdialects of Musaler. There's what they call the Yoghun Oluk subdialect, which was spoken in Yoghun Oluk and Khdrbek and Vakuf, which are the blue dots in the map. Now, if you look at Turkish maps or even Google Maps, you'll see their Turkish names used instead. So Yoghun Oluk, Khdrbek, and Vakuflu. Ataturk had a scheme to change all of the non-Turkish place names in Turkey that took place over a span of 40 or 50 years, starting in the 1920s. But interestingly, some of the names of the Armenian villages in this area survived relatively unaltered, probably because to the engineers of this memory erasure program, they didn't look like Armenian place names. Then higher up the mountain side, we have Bitias and Haji Habibli, which formed another subdialect. Bitias is now called Batı Ayaz, so it's been Turkified, the name of it. Haji Habibli is not listed in any form approximately close to Haji Habibli in pronunciation, but it seems to be where there's a new Turkish village called Eriklikuyu. So I've labeled current Eriklikuyu as Haji Habibli, but I cannot guarantee that that new village that was formed was put on the site of old Armenian Haji Habibli. If any of you have inside information about that, email me or send me a comment. And then finally, the third subdialect is typically called the Kabusiye dialect. The modern name for that village is Kapı Suyu, so they've Turkified the old name. And then it was spoken originally in Çevlik or Çavrik and Marachuk. So these are the areas where Musaler dialect was primarily spoken until 1915. And I asked Hagop to pronounce the original Armenian names of these, which you can see in this chart on this slide. And I've given you Armenian versions and IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet transcriptions of them, along with their standard Armenian names and their modern Turkish names. So here's Hagop pronouncing them from top to bottom.
Betyus, Hablak, Gabisuk, Makov, idder, Yoghun Oluk,
Okay, so I'll play them one more time for you.
betyus, hablak, gabisuk, makuf, idder, Yoghun Oluk,
You'll notice here, among other things, that a Q shows up twice in Maqaf and in some people's pronunciations of Yoghun Oluk. Also, you'll notice a feature that's unusual in Armenian dialects, which is geminate or long consonants, like in idder for what's now called in Turkish Khdrbek or traditional Khdrbek. So those are the classic villages of the Musaler region. What happened after 1915 when the Ottomans came in? As we all know, there was a heroic resistance against the Ottoman attempt to wipe out the Armenian communities of this area. And the survivors eventually were saved on a French ship and taken to Port Said in Egypt. They then returned in 1919 and ultimately were taken, at least in part, to Haigatasht, just a little bit south of the villages we've been talking about so far. And then in 1939, there were larger migrations to Anjar in Lebanon. And there still is a community, the last surviving one in this area of Armenians in Vakuf, or modern Vakuf-L. And then in 1946, there was a return to the homeland, as it were, where many Musalertsis went to the Republic of Armenia in the Soviet Union. And they went to a number of specific places, including Nor Musaler, New Musaler, Nor Aresh, New Aresh, and so on. The main diaspora settlement for Musaler Armenians was Anjar. And you can see a picture, you can see it's a planned town on the corner of old Umayyad ruins. And interestingly, the Musaler villages were each put in a specific subpart originally of Anjar. So the villagers from Kabusiye were put in the top left bit, the villagers from Yoghun Oluk just below them, and so on. And this separation of the inhabitants of the original 6 villages seems to have played a part in the subdialects of those villages remaining distinct, to the point where if you speak with older speakers today, they often will still have their own original subvariety. Though Hagop was telling me earlier that younger speakers have begun to mix those together. Also famously, in Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, there are a few diaspora settlements of Musaler Armenians. So for example, if you look at the 1984 ethnographic collection of Musaler stories of the 1915 defense, folk tales, etc., collected by Virginie Savazlian, you'll find that one of her informants was Hagop Derbedrosian, here in the left side of the slide. He was from Yoghun Oluk. He was actually born there in 1908. So he was quite young when his family had to flee to Port Said. He came back to Yoghun Oluk in 1919, but then in 1927, he went to Beirut and then to Aleppo, where his son Levon was born, and in 1945. And then right after that, the family moved to Nor Aresh, which is on the south side of Yerevan today. And that's where Levon grew up, and eventually he became the first president of the new Republic of Armenia, as I'm sure you all know. So Nor Aresh is one of the other diaspora settlements of Musaler Armenians, in addition to containing people from Aresh in Azerbaijan. Okay, now let's move on to the development of the Musaler dialect from Indo-European. Our starting point for considering this issue is the modern varieties of Armenian. There are 120 different varieties of modern Armenian studied in Georg Jahukyan's 1972 Introduction to Armenian Dialects. 3 of them are the 3 subdialects of the Musaler area, but there are many others covered: Van, Nor-Jura, Agulis, Tiflis, et cetera, But actually, beyond these 120 varieties of Armenian that Jahukyan documents, more than 500 varieties of modern Armenian have been documented in the Dialect Institute's database. In Yerevan. They produced in the 70s a manual for the collection of Armenian dialect material, and they then sent out field workers to more than 500 locations, and they collected about answers to about 700 lexical and grammatical questions, and they collected specific folk tales as well. So the Armenian dialect world is extremely rich and varied compared to what you find with other languages in the world. On top of these 500 varieties that the Dialect Institute worked on, there are others that you can't find typically reported on. So Aresh that I mentioned, one of the bases of this Nor Aresh community, was an Armenian settlement in Northeast Azerbaijan that is not reported on in Jahukyan's book. The Baghdad Armenian community and the Basra communities each had their own varieties of Armenian, at least before the US invasion in the 90s. Jerusalem had its own Armenian dialect until the late 90s. Tehran has a mixed dialect of Armenian that's quite interesting. Then there are many, many kinds, I would say even hundreds of varieties of Hamshen Armenian spoken in Northeast Turkey and in Abkhazia and the contiguous part of Russia. And there were also some varieties spoken in Central Asia, but I think those communities after the fall of the Soviet Union largely moved westward again. Then in northern Iraq and Iran, you can also find Armenian communities that haven't been studied, such as Zakho in northern Iraq. I've worked with some refugees from there who spoke the local variety of Armenian. On top of those, there are some mixed languages, as we call them in linguistics, that have an Armenian base to them. So for example, Lomavren is a mixed language where the grammar is from the Erzurum dialect of Armenian, but the lexicon or the words come from an Indic language that was brought with the gypsies from India. Those who ended up originally in Northeast Anatolia ended up speaking this language called Lomavren, which is still spoken today in parts of the Republic of Armenia and parts of the west of Turkey, especially in Istanbul. Armeno-Kipchak was a mixed language that was spoken in Eastern Europe until fairly recently. There are actually many publications about Armeno-Kipchak by Schütz and a few others. And then Armeno-Turkish is a richly documented and literarily attested variety of Armenian that was written in Armenian script. It is described superficially as a kind of Turkish, but it actually has a large amount of Armenian lexical and grammatical content to it as well. So with all of these hundreds of varieties of modern Armenian, how did we develop this rich variety coming from a single Indo-European proto-language? Well, the first step in the development was that the Indo-European proto-language began to split apart sometime between 4000 BC and about 2500 BC. And it ended up producing many descendants. The first set of Indo-Europeans to split off from the main family seems to have been what became the Anatolian language group. So they stayed where the where the Indo-Europeans may have started, according to Indo-Europeanist Eric Hamp in Eastern Anatolia, the Armenian homeland also. So the Anatolian family is Hittite, Luvian, Lycian, languages like that, Carian. Then the next groups to split off, according to this tree on the right side of the slide, which comes, I think, from Don Ringe, an Indo-Europeanist at Penn, were Tocharian, which ended up in China, and the Italo-Celtic family, which ended up in largely in Western Europe. Then, according to this grouping, Greek and Armenian split off, and they later separated from each other. This grouping is not universally accepted, by the way. So some Indo-Europeanists think that Greek and Armenian did not form a common sub-branch of Indo-European, but others think they did. Other linguists believe that Greek and Armenian also grouped with the Indo-Iranian family. There are numerous reasons for this. They share many features in common. If you're interested in this question of the relationship between Armenian, Greek, and Indo-Iranian, I recommend James Claxon's book on this topic, which is clearly written and very thoroughly argued. Then the next branches to split off were the Germanic and Balto-Slavic groups. So that would include Lithuanian and Russian and Polish and German and English and Icelandic and so on. And the end result is that in this little branch of the tree here in the very center of the Indo-European tree, you end up having Armenian as a separate family within the Indo-European language group. And put in more linguistic terms, if you start with Indo-European, one of the key changes that separated Armenian from the other Indo-European daughters was they had a set of consonant shifts where original Indo-European B, D, and G and so on, so plain voice stops, devoiced. So for example, the word for 10 in Indo-European was decumt, and that comes out in classical Armenian with a T, dasen. And we'll see what happens to that in Musaler later. And then the original voiceless unaspirated stops of Indo-European, aspirated in Armenian. So for example, in the number for 8, okto in Indo-European, you get ut with an aspirated T in classical Armenian. And then the third set of stop consonants in Indo-European were called voiced aspirates, like duh, buh, and so on, like you still hear today in Hindi, and actually in a lot of dialects of Armenian, Nujolfa, Mush, and so on, Sivas. These lost their aspiration in old or classical Armenian. So for example, beremi, meaning I carry in Indo-European, became berem in classical Armenian with an unaspirated B. And then the next stage, moving down this temporal tree to Musaler, was from the Proto-Armenian grouping, a southwestern dialect group split off, where the plain voiceless and plain voiced series of classical and common Armenian switched with each other, apparently. So original T became D, original D became T. And this southwestern group contains the Cilician dialects, so Marash, Zeytun, Hajin, and then originally Sis and a few others, Furnuz, and so on. And also the Syrian dialects, so Beylan, Kesab, Aramo, Musaler, etc. And within the southwestern group, this Syrian group then split into two. One that deleted the definite article, as we'll see later. So Khdrbek, Kabusier, Yoghun Oluk deleted the old definite article in most cases. And then a group that preserved the definite article, which includes Haji Habibli, Bitias, Vakuf, but also Kesab and Aramo and Beylan. So within the Syrian varieties of Armenian, the traditional ones, so I'm not counting Damascus and Aleppo and so on right now. Within the traditional Syrian dialects, there isn't actually a clean break between Musaler and Kesab and Aramo and so on. There's a sort of mix, which we model in linguistics with what's called the wave model of linguistic development rather than the traditional tree model. Okay, now let's go from classical Armenian to Musaler, now that we've already done a bit from Indo-European to classical or Old Armenian. Let's start with the consonant shift I alluded to, which happened in Cilician Middle Armenian, or at least it had occurred by the time of the documents from the 11th to the 15th centuries that we have from Cilicia in Armenian. So to make sense of what happened with the consonants, we need to discuss a concept that was actually developed by Hracia Ajarian, the greatest Armenian linguist, and I would say one of the greatest linguists of any ethnicity, who has existed in the last 200 plus years. He did his PhD in Paris with Antoine Meillet, a famous Indo-Europeanist who was very interested in Armenian and actually spent time studying in Echmiadzin. But he did his phonetic work with the Abbé Rousselot, who was one of the earliest phoneticians to use actual machinery to study the acoustic properties of human speech. And working with Rousselot, Ajarian already knew about the differences in pronunciation of the consonants across the Armenian dialect world. And he mentioned these differences to Rousselot, and they set out to try to figure out what acoustic parameters or articulatory parameters were actually distinguishing the pronunciations in the 7 main groups of Armenian dialects. And what Ajarian came up with was this thing we now call voice onset time, which refers to the amount of time between when you release a closure in your mouth and when your vocal folds start vibrating to make a vowel following that consonant. So let's say that I make the syllable ba. To make the B, I close my lips. And then to make the ah after it, I have to open that closure and then start making an ah. And the key component of the ah that enables us to hear it clearly is our vocal folds are opening and closing very rapidly. In the case of me, they're opening and closing about 80 times per second. For your average female, they're opening and closing about 200 times a second. And what Ajarian found was there were consistent differences in the amount of time between when, say, this labial closure for B was released and when the following vowel started having these vocal cord vibrations. And these time differences were consistent between different types of consonant and then across languages and dialects. And Ajarian is not widely credited with having come up with this discovery of voice onset time as a core linguistic variable. However, he did come up with it, and some historians of linguistics in the West do acknowledge that now. So that's a good step forward. But the voice onset time was rediscovered in 1964 by Lisker and Abramson in an article called A Cross-Language Study of Voicing and Initial Stops. So they are typically credited by people who don't know the history of the field with having come up with this theory, but it was actually Ajarian, the Armenian linguist, who did 65 years earlier. So the key thing that's been discovered for human languages is there are basically 3 main categories of voice onset time that human languages choose from to make their stop consonants like P, T, or K, or B, D, or G. One set is called pre-voiced stops. And in these, you actually start voicing, so vibrating or opening and closing your vocal folds while you're still making the closure for the stop consonant. So in the International Phonetic Alphabet, we represent these pre-voiced sounds as symbols like B, D, and G. And the next type of consonant that human languages normally use are called short lag voiceless stops. And these have a voice onset time typically of between 0 and 35 milliseconds. And in the International Phonetic Alphabet, we write these with P, T, K, and so on. And then the third type of series that human languages tend to use are called long lag voiceless stops. And these have a voice onset time of typically more than 35 milliseconds. Interestingly, it's been found that not only do humans have these three categories, but actually non-human animals also have a perceptual boundary between the long lag voiceless stops and the short lag ones. So it's been found with chinchillas and rhesus macaques and pigeons and many other kinds of animals that they have a perceptual boundary between d and t, for example, or b and p. Even though they don't have languages themselves, human type languages, as far as we know, they distinguish between these. So for example, you know about the classic Pavlovian conditioning paradigm with the dog and the bell and the food reward and the salivating. You can do that, say, with a dog, for example. Instead of ringing a bell, you can play them, say, a t, so something like ta with a long lag voiceless stop. And when you play ta, you have the food reward predictably come out. But when you play something like da with a short lag voiceless stop, you have the food not predictably come out. And the dog will very quickly pick up on this predictive difference where hearing a long lag voiceless stop predicts the food reward, hearing a short lag one doesn't. Once the dog is picked up on that, you can then vary the voice onset time between, say, 0 and 150 milliseconds and see which of those stimuli the dog responds to by salivating, expecting the food. And it's found that they respond to stimuli whose VOT is longer than 35 milliseconds. So they have that same perceptual boundary as humans do. In English, what we write as B, D, and G are typically actually short lag voiceless stops in word initial position. And in word initial position, what we write as P, T, and K in English are long lag voiceless stops. So in terms of the International Phonetic Alphabet, English really has T and the aspirated T, T with a superscript H. Whereas a language like Spanish has pre-voice stops, which they write as B, D, G, etc. And they have short lag voiceless stops, which they write as P, T, K. So Spanish would have in word initial position pre-voiced D and short lag voiceless D. English, on the other hand, would have short lag voiceless D and long lag voiceless T. In classical Armenian, and also in standard Eastern Armenian and in the Agulis dialect and a few others, what we call the group 6 dialects of Armenian, they actually have all three of these. So they have D, D, and T. Whereas in Istanbul, Western Armenian, for example, they have, this hasn't been properly studied, but to my ear, they seem to have the English type system, what we call an aspirating language, where they have short lag voiceless and long lag voiceless stops. But in Musaler and Kesab and Marash and Zeytun and so on, they have the Spanish series plus the aspirated series. So they have the same three series as classical Armenian, but with a twist that I'll show you in a second. So with this background about VOT, let's look at what exactly happened in the Armenian world, and especially in Musaler. So with the original Indo-European voiced aspirates, which we represent as a capital D followed by a superscript H. So this represents sounds B, D, G, G, and so on. A root like de, meaning to put, comes out in classical Armenian, losing its aspiration. So you just get, instead of a d, you get a d. So denem, I put, in classical Armenian. The original plain voice series, like in decumt 10 that I mentioned before, they devoice in classical Armenian. So they shift to the short lag voiceless category. And so from decumt, you get dasen in classical Armenian. And then the original Indo-European short lag voiceless category, represented by capital T, moves into the long lag category. They become aspirated. So from okto, or 8, you get ut with an aspirated T in classical Armenian. Then within the history of the Armenian family, these 3 series of classical Armenian shift again. In Istanbul, Western Armenian, the old plain voiceless series or short lag voiceless series like dasen shift over into the D category or voiced category. So you would get something like dasa. And the original voiced series like denem moves into the voiceless aspirated category. So you then get tenem, may I put. And that merges with the old aspirated series. So tenem and ut. So standard Western Armenian merges from 3 series that classical Armenian had into 2. Musaler and Kesab and Marash and so on, all the southwestern Armenian dialects also merge, but in different ways. So the old classical Armenian plain voiceless series becomes voiced. So dusa for 10 in Bitias, for example. And the classical Armenian plain voiced series becomes voiceless. In other words, old D and T from classical Armenian switch with each other in the southwestern Armenian dialects. So old denem, for example, in Bitias becomes denim with a voiceless T at the beginning. All Armenian varieties, though, keep the classical Armenian voiceless aspirates unchanged. By and large, we'll see there are some exceptions in final position in Musaler later. So for example, ut comes out in Bitias as ote, as we'll see again later. So these consonant shifts played a key role in differentiating Musaler and the other southwestern Armenian dialects from the rest of the Armenian dialect world. To put it in slightly simpler form, if we start with the classical consonant series, d, and t, in standard Western, d becomes d, and then d and t merge into t, whereas in the southwestern dialects, the d and d switch places with each other, which is quite interesting from a historical perspective. So this is actually a good giveaway for someone being from either Cilicia or Syria, if they're Armenian. If they pronounce a classical d as a d, and they pronounce a classical d as a d, then they probably are from either Cilicia or Syria. I see now, by the way, that I should have switched this D and T symbol in the bottom row here. Sorry about that. Okay, now let's consider what happens within the southwestern Armenian dialect group. Within this area, the Cilician dialects typically form one subgroup, and then the Syrian dialects form another, where by Syrian, I'm including Musaler just over the current present-day border. And within this, Musaler often subgroups with Kesab in particular. So for example, Anjar in his book on the dialects of Cilicia, as he calls it, but he actually means the whole southwestern group, he says that the Haji Habibli subdialect of Musaler has clean monophthongal vowels, whereas in the other two Musaler subdialects, where he means Yoghun Oluk and Kabusier, and also in Antioch, which he means Kesab by, these vowels become diphthongal or have two parts in them. And he gives this example of the Lord's Prayer. I apologize to those of you who speak either Habibli or Kesab dialect and don't agree with these renditions by Anjar. He collected these 100 years ago. The book wasn't published till 2003, but he did his field work quite a long time ago. And many people have reported to me that these forms don't exactly match with what they use today, but I'm going to use them since they're what he publishes. So as part of the Lord's Prayer, we have Haermer, Surb, this classical Yeritzi, Anun Ko. So our Father, may your name be holy or hallowed. In Haji Habibli, Anjar says that the vowels are clean and monophthongal, so they just have one part. So for example, you get uv, equivalent to ov for o or hu in standard Armenian. So there's a monophthongal u, whereas in Kesab you get uv with a diphthong, meaning a vowel that has two parts, u and and so on. Similarly, for b, in the subjunctive, you get a no in Haji Habibli according to Anjar, whereas in Kesab, according to him, you get an u with this diphthong u. So having diphthongized vowels is a feature that groups together Kesab with a subpart of Musaler. Another feature where Kesab shares its structure with Musaler is the making of the future tense, where both use br, which seems to be from classical Armenian bd, meaning it is necessary, and or, meaning that. So over the millennia, you get bd or reducing gradually and showing up in the end as br. So for example, in Tumanian's story, The Liar, Sudasana, you can see this in the part where the king says, whoever can tell such a lie that I say that's false, I'll give them half my kingdom. And the I will give is the bit I've excerpted here. In Kesab, you get burdumer, where that's from udum plus bur, and they have this special rule in Kesab that when you put bur with an u initial form together, the u and the r switch. So you get burdum er. And in Bitias, in Musaler, you get bur udumer. So both use this bur future marker that's distinctive to this region. However, sometimes Musaler does not group with Kesab. And this is the case, for example, with the formation of the present tense. So in classical Armenian, you just had a bare verb form like berem for I carry. But in almost all dialects of modern Armenian, you have to have something extra to make the present tense. So ge perem in standard Western Armenian, for example, or berumem in standard Eastern Armenian. On this slide, I've given you a plot of the main ways of making the present tense in Armenian dialects. Circled in purple in the bottom center of the slide are dialects that use ha or hai. So for example, for he, she, or it says in Kesab, you would take hai and add the c for says, and you get high c for he, she, or it says. You also get this construction, not just in Kesab, but also in Urfa, a bit farther north, in Malatya, in Agan, and then there's a pocket of Ha dialect speakers in the far west of Anatolia in the Adapazar region. So Bardizag, Adapazar, Nicomedia, and so on. Then over in the far east of the Armenian dialect world, we have this light purple area. And those are ones that use lis. You may know that in standard Eastern Armenian, if you have a monoconsonantal verb root, like d for give, or g for come, or l for cry, you use this lis to make the present. So la lisem, ga lisem, da lisem. But in these purple zones, they use lis for all present tense formations in some form. It often will, in individual dialects, will reduce to either an L or to an S. So for example, you see Payojuk here, where Rafi was from. This is a variety of Salmast dialect. They would say something like ertasem, for I go, where that's from ertalisem, but it's reduced to ertasem. Then the red dots are all gu varieties. So you can see that's mainly Western Armenian varieties. The blue line here I've indicated is basically the border between Turkey and its neighbors. And the gu dialects are typically to the west of that line. Now, if you go down to Musaler and Kesab, you'll see there's a pocket of gu dialects in this Ha zone. And that is the Musaler varieties and also the Aleppo variety of Armenian, which I would say is basically a variety of standard Western Armenian by and large. So Musaler and also Beylan and also Aleppo are an island of gu dialects sandwiched in between Kesab and some other Ha dialects. So Kesab and Musaler don't always group together. Now let's look at subdialects of Musaler. First, I have a challenge for you. I'm going to play you 2 recordings of the same thing, which is a passage from the liar story I mentioned earlier. And I want you to see if you can guess what 2 subdialects of Musaler these are. So I'm going to play them first, then we'll put up the poll, and then I'll give you a chance to guess what they are. Okay, here's the first one.
Vaxten, Takavir Magur, Ger, Gausi, Jogabirten, Ov, Te Söd Magasi, Is Gasim Södi, Takavortenes, Gise Brudum
Okay, play it one more time.
Vaxten, Takavir Magur, Ger, Gausi, Jogabirten, Ov, Te Söd Magasi, Is Gasim Södi, Takavortenes, Gise Brudum
Okay, and here is the second variety.
Söd Husuch, Gir Uchikir, Takavir Magir. As Takavir, Ashkaren Mech, Ermani Gutarnum. Uv Garnu Turzan Said Bahusa, Isa Asim Saidi, Takavrutenem Gish Gudum Anir. Uvayv Ma Gyuku Guasi.
Okay, I'm sorry the recording quality was not great. I recorded that about 10 years ago on Skype before the Zoom revolution, and Skype audio was not great. Okay, Jora, will you put up the poll?
The second poll?
Yeah, poll number 2. Okay. Here are the options. I want you to guess whether the first recording I played was Bitias, the second was Yoghun Oluk, or the first one was Haji Habibli, the second was Bitias, and so on. Now that you can see the options, I'm going to play the 2 recordings for you again. So here's the first one.
Vaxten, Takavir Magur, Ger, Gausi, Jogabirten, Ov, Te Söd Magasi, Is Gasim Södi, Takavortenes, Gise Brudum
All right, and here's the second variant.
Söd Husuch, Gir Uchikir, Takavir Magir. As takavir eraşkaren meç Ermeni gutarnu. Uv garnu tırzan sayt bakhusa isa asim saydi. Em takavrutenen geç gudum anir. Uvayv ma göku guasi.
Okay. I'll play them one more time while I'm giving you a chance to pick your two dialects, and then we'll go see what the answers are.
Wachten. Takavir magur. Ger. Gausi. Jogabirten. Ov. Te söd magasi. Is gasim södi. Em takavortenes. Gise brudum
And here's the second one last time.
Söd husuq. Gir uçikir takavir migir. As takavir eraşkaren meç Ermeni gutarnu. Uv garnu tırzan sayt bakhusa isa asim saydi. Em takavrutenen geç gudum anir. Uvayv ma göku guasi.
Okay. Let's see. So Jora, will you? Yeah, there we go. So it looks like Bitias and then Yoghun Oluk was the most popular guest. That was correct. So we must have a lot of Musaler people in the audience at this point. Yes, the first one was Garo Kadian from Bitias, who's been extremely helpful to me over the years. And the second was Hayar Narek, who helped me a lot, thanks to David Vulkasian about 10 years ago. It was from Yoghun Oluk community originally. Okay, so hopefully you could see from those samples that there actually are significant differences between the subdialects of Musaler. And these dialects have been observed in many of the written sources on these on the Musaler dialect. And the basic pattern that emerges that pretty much everyone agrees on is there are three dialect regions, subdialect regions. The red area is called the Kabusier or Kabusier subdialect. And that was originally spoken apparently also in Chevlik and Marajuk. Then there was the Yoghun Oluk subdialect group spoken in Yoghun Oluk, Khdrbek, and Vakuf. And then higher up on the mountain, there was the Haji Habibli dialect, subdialect, which was spoken in Haji Habibli and Bitias, and according to some in Karachai. I'm a bit suspicious of that, but I've never met anyone from there. So if any of you have any inside information on that, please email me or send a chat comment. So those are the subdialects of Musaler. Now here are some examples. I've tried to pick a nice simple set so that you can get your head around the differences, but also so that there are enough differences to make clear that the two varieties are quite different. So representing the Haji Habibli subdialect, I have Bitias. These forms are from Garo. He recorded them for me just a few weeks ago. And then representing the Yoghun Oluk subgroup, we have Khdrbek forms that Hago Panosian kindly recorded for me a few days ago. So first, let's listen to the Bitias numbers.
Miq, Ergök, Erk, Çük, Heng, Vitse, Jute, Öte, Enne, Dusse.
So there you can see some features that are unusual in the Armenian dialect realm, such as having a usular stop, like I mentioned at the beginning, the of miq for one. And that's quite interesting because this is a native Armenian form. One wonders how a Q would have developed there. Also, Bitias, along with several varieties of Musaler, has front rounded vowels like and U. So in the number for two, ergök, and U in chuk. Whereas in Khdrbek, they don't have quite as many of these new vowels. So you would instead get ergak and so on. So let's now compare Hagop's production in the Khdrbek variety. So we're going to start with Nye and go down this rightmost column to Dos.
Me, ergak, irk, choik, hang, veits, yield, ait, oin, dos.
One point of interest here that I alluded to earlier is normally Armenian dialects keep the voiceless aspirated stops unchanged, like ut with a t. But Hagop, and indeed many speakers in Musaler, produces an unaspirated, unreleased T in the number for 7, and also in the number for 8. This sometimes happens in final position or before another consonant. And this unreleased phenomenon where you make the closure with your tongue and your palate or teeth, but don't release it at the end of the consonant, that's represented with a half of a square in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So listen again to Hagop's numbers, paying attention to that d instead of t in 7 and 8.
Me, ergak, irk, choik, hang, veits, yield, ait, oin, dos.
So you can see there are quite a few differences between these two members of two of the main subdialects of Musaler. When you add in Kabusiye and Haji Habibli, there are even more differences. So actually, each of the 6 main villages has noticeable differences in the number system. I didn't include here because of time reasons, but I'll mention it now very quickly, that many speakers of Musaler varieties have borrowed Turkish forms for 60, 70, 80, 90, if I remember correctly. It's either 3 or all 4 of those decads. And that actually is the norm in Western varieties of Armenian. So one spoken in the former Ottoman Empire. So Musaler is pretty consistent in that sense. All right, now let's move on to some interesting archaisms or preservations that you find in the Musaler dialect. And after that, we'll look at some interesting innovations that the dialect has made. We're going to focus on a few morphological archaisms, and for innovations, we'll look at phonological ones. So first, archaisms in the nominal declension, or the way you form nouns. In classical Armenian, the plural was normally, almost always, marked with an aspirated K suffix. So let's say you had gir for a letter or character, the plural of that would be girk, which obviously then ended up becoming the word for book, a collection of letters. But in modern Armenian dialects, that k has been replaced, and this was true already in medieval Armenian, by er and ner. So in late classical Armenian and then in medieval Armenian, early medieval Armenian, it was yar and nyar, but those eventually became er and ner and replaced the k. But according to Pashayan, who was from Haji Habibli and published a few articles on Musaler in the 60s, in his variety, if you have a noun that ends in a, it will still take as its plural marker the old classical Armenian aspirated K. So for example, from Yegeretzi for church, in his variety, you get giritza for church, and then plural giritzak, not giritza ner. And from gashi for leather, I guess, you get gisha and plural gishak. From garni, you get garna, garnak. From maki for sheep, you get maka, plural makak, and so on. So there's an archaism in nominal declension, which is that the old classical plural aspirated K is preserved, but by and large only after a final nouns. I think there are other classes that preserve it too, but this is the main category. Also, in classical Armenian, there were many ways of forming the instrumental. So this is, the instrumental is what you make with ov in standard Armenian today. But in classical Armenian, there were many instrumental endings. One of them for the a declension was amb. And this comes out in Musaler as either in the Haji Habibli group, or as u in the Yoghun Oluk group. So for example, for eat cheese with bread, and the instrumental is going to show up in with bread here. So instead of hatzov in standard Armenian with ov, you instead get or u. So banera hatzum gir. And here we have the instrumental, and notice also hatz has a geminate or long tse. That's another feature of interest in Musaler dialects. In Yoghun Oluk subdialect, the has reduced further to u. But both of these are archaisms relative to the standard modern Armenian ov instrumental, which is a newer development. In the verbal conjugation, or the ways of making verbs, you also find archaisms. So in classical Armenian, there were 4 verb conjugations according to what vowel they used before the endings. So there was an E conjugation like sirel, an I conjugation like chosil, an A conjugation like charal, and an U conjugation like tohu. In standard Western Armenian, they've merged these 4 into 3. So the E and I conjugation, the U conjugation has disappeared, and the individual verbs that were in it have merged into the other 3 categories. Standard Eastern Armenian has gone even farther and has merged conjugations 1 and 2, the E and I ones, into the E conjugation. So they only have the E and A conjugations left now in Standard Eastern. In Musaler, they've merged all 4 of them in the infinitive ending. So it's il for all of them. So Cyril, this is according to Pashayan, by the way. Some of you Musalertzis may not agree with this, but in his Haji Habibli variety, this is the case. Cyril, Chusil, Charil, Turil. So all of them have the il infinitive suffix. However, when you put on the personal endings, so like I do X or they do X, then the underlying theme vowels show up, and you see that Musaler has preserved all 4 original classical conjugations intact. So the old E conjugation, conjugation 1, comes out as an I. So geu sirim. The old I conjugation comes out with an E. So geu chusem. The old A conjugation, conjugation 3, comes out as U, geu harun. And the old U conjugation, conjugation 4, comes out with A in Pashayan's dialect. So geu turam. Not all Musaler subdialects have this A outcome of class 4, but that's what Pashayan had in the 60s. So the key is Musaler has preserved all 4 classical Armenian verb conjugations, unlike standard Western and standard Eastern Armenian. Now let's move on to phonological innovations in Musaler. First, there's this uvular stop Q, which is extremely rare in the Armenian dialect world. So it shows up in loan words like maqaf, which we heard Hago produce at the beginning today for the village Vakuf. And also Yoghun Oluk. Many speakers produce that with a voiceless uvular stop at the end. Those are both borrowings into Musaler dialect from neighboring languages. But you also find the Q showing up in native Armenian words, interestingly. So we heard Garo say mik for one, and we heard Hagop for he, she, or it found it say yakaltze with a k from the original classical Armenian G. So you get innovation of this mysterious uvular stop in native words, not just being borrowed in foreign words. And then perhaps the most noticeable innovation in Musaler is the vowel system. There's been a large series of vowel shifting that has happened. And Yoghun Oluk has the largest vowel system as a result. But I'm going to play you examples from Hagop's system in Khdrbek dialect. And we're going to start with the short vowels. And we're going to go from E to U, U, E, A in order. And these are organized in terms of those vowels showing up in Yoghun Oluk, in Andreasjan's variety of it in his 1967 book. Khdrbek has fewer of these vowels, but you'll still hear many of them going on. And you're going to hear in the recording from Hagop in a second, first the English form, then the classical form, but pronounced in Western Armenian, then the Khdrbek dialect form, then the Yoghun Oluk, he doesn't pronounce the Yoghun Oluk form, so I just put them here in the chart for comparison. So we're going to start with oil, then the classical for oil, then Khdrbek for oil, then move down the chart.
Oil, yur, ir, all, polor, pülür, foot, voden, vod, belt, kodi, kuda, price, kin, gen, aul, pu, pe, knife, tanak, tanag, cross, khach, khach.
So we can see a number of interesting features here. One you find in Armenian dialects today in general, which is the old classical Armenian diphthongs have reduced to monophthongs. So like U, written I-W in classical Armenian, is an E now in the word for oil, ir. Secondly, you can see that Khdrbek and Musaler in general has developed an U, a front high rounded vowel, like in the word for all, bülür. Thirdly, you can see that Musaler has long or geminate consonants, even in final position in a word, which is very rare cross-linguistically. So like vud with a long D for foot. That long D comes from the assimilation of DN, or originally TN in the classical word for foot. You can also see that Yoghun Oluk subgroup has developed an like we heard in one of Garo's numbers for Bitias earlier. That's actually from the Haji Habibli subdialect. But in Khdrbek, that doesn't seem to show up and it unrounds to A. So be for owl instead of b, the Yoghun Oluk form from Andreasjan. Thirdly, or fourthly, or fifthly, you can see that Musaler has an a that you don't find in standard Armenian. So danug for knife. And then finally, Yoghun Oluk variety, as described by Andreasjan, has a long a as opposed to a short a. So they have a and a. But Khdrbek doesn't seem to have that contrast. Now let's move on to diphthongs. These are vowel sounds that have two parts to them, like or yeah, that kind of thing. Here are some examples of diphthongs that show up in Hagop's Khdrbek variety. In this recording I'm going to play you, Hagop produces the English gloss, then the classical form produced in Western Armenian way, and then the Khdrbek form. And then we'll go down the chart in that way. So starting with last.
Last, or final, hedin, iddain, spring, karun, kareun, you, to, teun, wherever, yur, yaur, awake, artun, artaun.
So this is just a sampling of 5 of the diphthongs that Hagop's Khdrbek variety has. Andreasian reports in his Yoghun Oluk variety 31 different diphthongs. Whether those are actually accurately reported and whether they're still alive today in Yoghun Oluk speakers remains to be verified. But there's plenty to keep us busy in Hagop's variety here. So we see I as a diphthong, and one manifestation of I that I find amusing is in the word for 8, which is either ait or aita. I can't remember which. Let's see. Ait. That sounds like the Australian English number for 8. Ait. So Khdrbek and Australian English end up with the same word for 8, which I find highly amusing. Okay, now let's go back to the diphthongs. So Khdrbek has an I, has another long D like we saw in foot. It has ash in garaun. It has ew, this ew diphthong that many Musaler varieties have. But it also has eu in the word for you singular. It has ow, like in yaur, and it has au, like in artaun. So these diphthongs are completely distinctive to the Syrian varieties of Armenian, by which I mean specifically Musaler and then Kesab and Aramo and Beylan and so on. I'm not counting Damascus and Aleppo. And obviously Vakuf L is not in Syria, but I group it together with the Syrian dialects. The next interesting phenomenon I alluded to at the beginning today, which is only found in a subset of Musaler varieties, which is deletion of the definite article that typically then has knock-on effects on the preceding vowel. So let's say you have Yerechan Nastadzer Kednin in standard Western Armenian. So that Yerechan is the child, Nastadzer was seated, Kednin on the ground. In Bitias dialect, the word Yerecha is not used. Instead, they use this Turkish borrowing, Çocuk, for child, and you add on the definite article to make the child, so Çocuk. So you get Çocuk Nastudzi Kidain, as we'll hear here, produced by Garo. And the key for our purposes right now is you just get a straightforward O and then the definite article schwa, like you get in most kinds of Armenian. But in Vakuf, for example, they delete the definite article and lengthen the preceding vowel. So for a child, you get Çocuk, but for the child, you get Çocuk with a long ow. So you end up getting Çocuk Nastudzi Kidnen. And notice they also delete the auxiliary verb e. So instead of getting Nastudzi, you delete the I and then lengthen the U to ew. So Nastudzi comes out as Nastudz. So here is Vahak pronouncing this in Vakuf dialect.
Çocuk Nastudzi Kidnen.
So that's a significant difference, not only between Vakuf, for example, and Yoghun Oluk on one hand, and say Bitias on the other, but between Vakuf and Yoghun Oluk and all other varieties of Armenian. This loss of the definite article with compensatory lengthening of the preceding vowel is very, very unusual in Armenian and in the languages of the world in general, in fact. And this loss of the definite article produces a range of interesting alternations in the Yoghun Oluk subdialect. So that's Yoghun Oluk, Khdrbek, that we talked about before, and Vakuf. So here are some examples in Hago Panosian's Khdrbek variety of the Yoghun Oluk subdialect. So we're going to start with hand up in the upper left, and he's going to read across. So Zar will be hand, Zor will be the hand, and then I'll say it means hand. And then for comparison, I've given you the classical Armenian forms that they came from in the right-hand column. Here we go.
Tsar, Tsor, hand. Tsün, Tsain, snow. Shon, shaun, dog. Zang, Zang, Zung, Ni. Mag, Ma, mouse. Murt, Mort, man. Pirun, Pireun, mouth, and the mouth. Beard, board, navel. Zizur, zizoir, swallow. Khanzur, khanzeur, firebrand. Seared, soiled, heart. Tsen, tsain, horse, and the horse. Tanag, tane, knife, and the knife. Irgung, irgieng, milestone, millstone, and the millstone. Keun, cown, sleepy.
Okay, so you can see there is a very complex and systematic structure of alternations between bare nouns like hand and definite forms of them like the hand, where in other kinds of Armenian, you have a very simple way of marking that contrast, namely by adding to make the definite. But in the Yoghun Oluk subgroup, including Khdrbek and Vakuf, you get this change where definiteness is marked by changes in length and quality of the last vowel of the root. Okay, let's end up now with a fun bit of culture involving something I like to work on, sun showers. There's actually a question about sun showers in the Manual for Collection of Armenian Dialect Forms, which I mentioned to you near the beginning today. So this was produced by Muradian et al. In 1977. It's an amazing document. It's very, very helpful for collecting material from Armenian dialect speakers. If any of you are interested in doing that with yourselves, if you speak a dialect, or with your grandparents or whatever, and you'd like to see this manual to get an idea of the kind of questions you can ask, feel free to email me. So question 12 in this manual is Arev Yeranagin Paragansrev. So light rain and sunny weather. And you're supposed to ask your dialect speaker, what do they say when you have light rain that falls while the sun is shining? And they give some answer options in the manual, like Arev Mar, which literally means sun sieve, Arev Tzoch, sun dew, Gotashar, stem dew, and those are not all that interesting to me compared to what we're going to see in a second. You can add to this list another fairly pedestrian expression, Baruch Ansrev, in Marash dialect. Paran Sonens told me this once. It literally means thin rain. But actually, when you look around in the Armenian world, most varieties of Armenian have very interesting expressions for what I call the sun shower in English. For example, in Derer, in the Echmadzin region, they say Gilu Harsanik, meaning wolf wedding. And in other parts of the Armenian world, you can see Gulashar in Karabakh, Gilatsnuk. So these are wolf rain, wolf birth, Geltsaknuk, wolf birth again, and so on. And if you pull back and look at the Armenian world as a whole, what you find is there are 5 main types of expression in the traditional Armenian world. There are expressions involving a wolf giving birth. Those are represented by the red dots here on the map. So like in Tiflis and in the Hajin region, over into Karabakh and Azerbaijan and so on. Deer birth expression, so like the deer is giving birth on the mountain. You find that in Sivas here. Wolf weddings are very common. Those are, well, they are in general, not so much in the Armenian world, but you find some like that in Armenia itself. Bird wedding, so the birds are getting married, is used up in the Hamshen region, right in the border with Georgia. And then several varieties of Armenian say the devil's beating his wife. Those are the green ones here in Aintab, for example, also in Damascus and so on. Interestingly, the devil's beating his wife is what Americans in the south of the United States tend to say also, and it's found in parts of France and many other parts of the world. So this is all culturally interesting, but what about this white dot here where Musaler is? I've left out what the answer for that is. So what do you think is the Musaler expression for sun shower, when rain falls while the sun is shining? Well, Hagop informs me that he says, Ariv ansriv tibignira harasnak. So Ariv, sun, ansriv, rain. Tibignira is the jackals, and harsnak is wedding. So sun and rain, jackals, wedding. And this is very, very similar to what Andreasian mentions in his 1967 book. So in his Yoghun Oluk variety, he has sun and rain, the jackals are getting married. And you also find variants of this in Kesab. So for example, Solag Apelian tells me that in Kirkune, they say Tibignen harsnek hainin. So Tibignen is the jackals, harsnek is wedding, and then hainin is that hai for present tense plus an L to do. So they are doing a wedding. And George Terterian, whose parents were from Kesab and Dozaraj, says Erivek and Riveg Tibigun harsnek. So sun, rain, jackals, wedding, or he says, he translates it as coyote's wedding. Coyote is a type of jackal. So jackal's wedding seems to be within the Armenian world, particular to this little region that we've been focusing on today, Kesab, Musaler type area. However, you find jackal's weddings in a wide swath of the world's cultures. So in Africa, the languages of Morocco typically will say some form of the jackals are getting married. So in Moroccan Arabic, you find Dib and so on. In Tashalhit and Tamazight Berber, similarly, that you say jackals are getting married. In Algeria, some of the languages have the same expression. In Namibia, the same, and also in South Africa. So for example, in Afrikaans, they say jakals trouw met wolfse vrouw. So jackal is wedding with the wife of the wolf. Interestingly, the Arabic varieties spoken around Musaler itself don't seem to say jackal's wedding. It's only these ones in North Africa, as far as I've found so far. So in the Syrian and Lebanese varieties of Arabic, what I tend to hear is some variant of wolf's wedding, or fox's wedding, or rat's wedding, or lizard's wedding. So I remember, for example, the the guys from Jerusalem who worked at the Lebanese / Palestinian restaurant as they build it in Harvard Square said, Firan bi Jawazo, the rats are getting married. Moving back to jackal's wedding, it's also extremely common in languages of South Asia. So you find the jackal's wedding expressions in Bengali, Bihari, Garo, which is the Sino-Tibetan language, Hindi, Malayalam, which is a Dravidian language, Punjabi, Pashto, Sinhalese, and so on. And you find it in Mazandarani, an Iranian language in Iran. So the notion of a jackal's wedding to express a sun shower is actually quite common in the world. So that's a little overview of the Musaler dialect and its varieties and how they fit into the Armenian world and the Indo-European world. I hope it was interesting to you. Unlike many times when I give a presentation on an Armenian dialect, there's a slightly positive note one can end on, which is in this new social media age, there have actually been some groups that have, in the past few years, been extremely active in documenting Musaler dialect, both in videos of older speakers, which are the best thing in my opinion, but also in publishing digital versions of folk tales and so on. And two that I'll single out because I'm particularly impressed by them are Shuashak, which you can find on Facebook. I've given their URL here, and also Anjari Lazu. Both of these have a lot of great materials they've been churning out over the last few years. And if you're interested in Kesab, there's also a Kesab Facebook group that's extremely active in producing specifically Kesab dialect materials. So there are good ways now to hear these dialects. And I hope that you'll check those out. And if you're a speaker yourself, you'll consider making your own videos of yourself, your parents, your grandparents, your relatives. And if you do, please let me know. The more we can collect, the better. And also the more of an online presence we can create, the better, because arguably that gives kids more incentive to value these varieties and take an interest in learning them and speaking them. So thanks very much. Thanks especially to Hago Panosian, who helped me a lot over the past week in collecting video and audio materials. And also Garo Kadian, who's helped me an incredible amount over the years, but also to many others on the list here who have been extremely helpful to me in documenting the Musaler dialect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bert. And this was a really interesting and very informative presentation. Now, if there are any comments or questions, please put it in the chat, or if you would like to say something, please raise your hand and then we'll let you speak. Any questions? Somebody has raised the hand here. Let's see. Hofsep has a comment or question. Yes, Hofsep Dolatyan.
Hello. One of the first times my name gets pronounced correctly, which makes sense because they're Armenians. So, hi, Bert. I have a question about. So, if one were to, let's say, work on, Musaler dialects and all that, would you feel like there's a substantial community of young speakers of the language, or is it mostly somewhat, there's like, language shift and language death? Like, is it somewhat more, not passed on to newer generations? I'm just wondering about that.
That's a great question, Hosep. Everyone who's listening, by the way, Hosep is a PhD in theoretical linguistics who, since finishing last year, was it last year or 2 years?
2020.
Has been incredibly active in documenting and analyzing different varieties of Armenian. And he's very interested in working on Musaler also. And he does very high level theoretical linguistic work. So it's good to have him on our side. And he's a very high energy individual, so he can get a lot done. And he's based in California now, right?
Yeah, in the Berkeley area.
Berkeley area.
Not LA, which is unlucky for me, but oh well.
So I'll defer your question to the experts here who would know whether any of the young Musaler Armenians are still speaking the dialects.
There are some in Anjar, of course, who still speak the language, the dialect, and but the younger generation tends to sometimes change the pronunciations, or for example, the BTSCs kind of speak the Yoghun Oluk or the Khdrbek dialect. So it's kind of getting to be mixed, and many of them speak Armenian, essentially. They don't even speak the dialect anymore. But there are some who still speak the dialect, yes.
Oh, okay. So would you say that in terms of like concentrations of young speakers of these dialects, they're mostly in Anjar and Kesab, or also in, let's say, in the
Yes,
American diaspora?
Yes, mostly. I don't think in the American diaspora you will find anybody like my daughter. Dorig is, you know, she doesn't really speak the dialect at all. So, and my sons too. But in Anjar, it's common. For example, my brother's sons, they all speak the dialect very well.
Oh,
Next, I guess,
thank you.
Antoine, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you. I also put it in the chat. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Very interesting. I have a question about how do you pronounce the word America and how you write it. I mean, the word America didn't exist until, I guess, the 16th century, but we write it with a K, and in
America.
Western
Yeah, we say it the same way, America.
That's an interesting one, isn't it, with loan words? Do you go by the classical / Eastern initial rendition and then adjust that the way Western Armenian pronunciations would adjust, giving Ameriga with a G? Or
Yes.
do you render the actual pronunciation America and use your Western Armenian way of spelling that? And it seems like the solution by Western Armenian speakers is typically what Hagop said, to have Ga. But I would guess that with more recent loan words, the other strategy is more often used. Let's say television. I would guess that Western Armenians, if they happen to borrow that instead of using, Herades or whatever the official word is, I would guess they would render that as television, not television, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes, television, because of the French influence in the Middle East. Yeah.
The issue.
Vahe, you had a question. You're muted. You're muted, Vahe. Yes, Vahe, you're mute. Any other questions? Alex has a question.
Oh.
Yeah, Vahe, okay, go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. I have been under the impression that, or I was taught that Kesab's language is generally known as Kespenok, and it is spoken in the Cilician region, and that Musa Darcy's, excuse my pronunciation, Cividisnok, something along those lines. Are those any phonetic bearing to the language that you were referring to, or giving, a different connotation of the language? Kespenok versus Cividisnok.
Cividinik, yeah.
Yeah, so Kespenok is the Kesab dialect word for Kesab dialect. So yes, it's definitely related to what we were discussing today.
But specifically to Kesab, or there are others who have spoke Kespenok outside Kesab region?
Well, I defer to Kesabtsis on this, but I would guess that the residents of the 7 original villages around Kesab would all say they're speaking Kespenok, but outside of that core 7, I don't know. I've never met anyone from the less well attested or populated villages around there. And then for Spedia / Musaler, Andreasian called it Kistinuk, but I'm not sure how widely used that is today. Hagop, do you know by any chance?
They normally say Svederen or yeah, Kistinuk also, but is used. I have heard them use it, yes.
And I've also seen Anjartsenek, which is sort of transferring the language suffix onto Anjar.
Right, yeah. Okay, Alex has a question. Yes, Alex, go ahead.
Hi, Bert. Thank you. That was really interesting. You'll be unsurprised to hear I'm very intrigued by this uvula. And I guess I wondered, I noticed that the first example you had of the uvula, which was on the numeral, you showed as aspirated, and the later ones not as aspirated, which kind of got me wondering how it fits into these laryngeal categories that you had discussed.
Yeah, you have a very sharp eye and ear. It was the same exact recording, and I'm not used to seeing aspirated uvulars in the languages I work on, so I tend to write it as just a Q. But the last time I was listening to it, it seemed quite clearly aspirated to me, so I decided to write in the aspiration superscript in that list of numbers. But I haven't done a systematic study of that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, okay. Oh, interesting. So you think it fits just into the phonologically into the or underlyingly, if you want to use that expression, into the unaspirated, like the voiceless unaspirated, or? That's
also a very good question. I don't know. I hadn't even thought to ask that question, but I should, and I will look into it. Yeah, given that Musaler has all 3 categories, that's an open question. The consonant that it descends from, historically at least, is in the voiceless aspirated series, but I'm not sure that's relevant in this case, because I don't know what sociolinguistically is going on with this shift to Q in that particular word. So thanks for that. I'll definitely look into that. That's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Moses K.
Yes, thank you very much for a very beautiful and enlightening speech. I'm from Aleppo myself. There are a couple villages between Kesab and Aleppo called Yaqubiya and Ghanemiye. They are Armenians that have been there for a long, long time. You did not mention them. I was wondering if their language belongs to the Kesab language or the Aleppo language.
Thank you for pointing that out. There are indeed a number of villages, old Armenian villages, that I didn't mention because they tend not to be talked about in the standard descriptions of Kesab and Musaler, and adding them in makes the map much messier. And then finally, I've never met anyone from them, so I don't have any actual information on them. So if you know anyone, I hope you'll send me a line so I can try to talk with them. But because I've never met anyone from there and I don't have any information, I can't give a good answer to your question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think based on my knowledge, when I was growing up in Aleppo, they used to come to Aleppo to go to school to learn Armenian, that they know they are Armenian, but most of them couldn't speak Armenian. They were speaking Arabic, kind of mixed Arabic, yeah.
Does anyone else who's here know?
Yes, I know several, and I've spent many summers in Yaqubiya and Kanai myself, and they speak very good Armenian, some of them became Catholics, and those are the ones who became Latin, in fact, and have lost the Armenian language. But the ones who remained apostolic Armenians speak Armenian very good, and I think, in my knowledge, is very good. I can understand some of the Kesabsi dialects with them, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm learning today, so I can't really say which dialect it is, but that's what it sounded like to me at the time.
Okay. Well, if you know of anyone from there who's still alive and you have contact with, I would love to speak with them. So we
Well,
can.
they are now in ISIS territory. They are not even allowed to sow their grain without getting a permission from the Mufti in Jisr al-Shughul, or in Idlib.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. Mariam Asatarian has a question. Mariam, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a small data question about the cases when we have an example, the child is sitting on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that in some varieties there is auxiliary drop.
Yeah.
And my question is, when they drop the auxiliary, does it reflect to morphologically the main verb? Does it have any influence on that?
It does phonologically,
Uh-huh.
but in any other sense, morphologically or otherwise, I would say no. However, Mariam, I'm not a syntactician, so I don't think to ask that kind of question. Are you a syntactician?
I do syntax semantics.
I think it would be great if you had any questions from that syntaxy angle. If you could email them to me, I can then ask some informants. Just because I don't do syntax, I don't think to ask syntactically interesting questions, I'm afraid. So I definitely welcome them from you.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mariam. Any other questions? I guess that's it then.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody. And again, if we don't have your email address, please put it in the chat, and then we'll send you the next event that we come up with. We have an event in June, but you will receive the announcement later. Thank you very much, Bert, and thank you everybody for listening and participating.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and please email me if you have any questions or comments or insights. I would love to hear them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.